Good morning. I visited Korea a few years ago to talk about my data, and I love Korea, especially the food. I grew to love kimchi and gochujang. Please forgive me if I've pronounced it incorrectly. Now, just let me set up my slides. So, since I spoke last time, I see that the Korean government has made good progress on implementing my data. The My Data movement offers a huge opportunity for social and economic transformation. Today, I want to talk a little bit about the opportunity, but mainly about how, because there are different models for how my data can work, and some will work better than others. But first, what is the problem we're trying to solve? Today, we have an organization-centric, one user, one use, or OU, personal data system. Organizations collect data about individuals, and they use this data for that particular organization's purposes, with each organization collecting and using its own data for its own purposes. The OU approach is a product of our technology history, and it has brought many benefits, but it also has limitations and creates some problems. So here are some of them. Because our current system is organization-centric, built around organizations collecting and using individuals' data, citizens are excluded from participating in its working. They don't have any real control over their data. They aren't able to access or use it for their own purposes. The system is increasingly seen as not safe and not fair. Meanwhile, organizations lack access to the data they need or face high costs and hurdles trying to access it. That's because no matter how much data any individual organization has, there's always far more data about that individual outside, including in other organizations' databases. Quality issues abound. Organizations spend a lot of time and money, too much time and money, trying to make sure that the data that they use is correct, complete, up-to-date, and reliable. So I was just saying that there's many we have all these problems, and what we need now is a many uses system. What we need is a new approach. Because data does not get used up when it is used, because data can be used by many users for many different purposes, the underlying logic of data points to the need for a very different data ecosystem, a moo ecosystem of many users and many uses of the same data. Today's data ecosystem is made up of many different separate organization silos, with data trapped inside each silo. To unleash the full potential of data, including personal data, we need a different setup. We need to move from many separate data silos to a single data sharing network, where each node in the network can access the data it needs to add the most value. So, to do that, we need a new data architecture and infrastructure, a data logistics infrastructure capable of getting exactly the right information to and from the right people and organizations at the right times. The big question is how best to do this. For the past 15 years, we at Mydex have been building a new citizen-centric data logistics infrastructure that opens the door to many users, many uses. And so this is how it works. Organizations holding data about individuals provide them with copies of this data, verifying details about them via a cryptographically secure token that cannot be tampered with. Individuals hold these verified attributes or credentials in their personal data store, where they retain control over their data. Each personal data store is separately encrypted, as Julian was talking about, and each individual holds their own private key to their personal data store. This puts them in control of their data and ensures their safety, security, and privacy. Individuals can add more data to their personal data store if they wish, including data that only they know and data about their plans, goals, priorities, preferences, and so on. Individuals can then share this data with service providers as and when needed. They may share extra details with service providers they already have relationships with, or they may bring their data to completely new service providers. That's up to them. It can be a huge amount of data, what's needed for an important decision in health or money, for example. Or it could be just a tiny amount of data, simply verifying a few details as the next step on a user journey. It doesn't matter. What matters is that exactly the right information is passing to and from the right people and organizations at the right time. This infrastructure is live and operational, and because we've been building it since 2007, it's already well established. For example, in 2011, we were chosen by the UK government to help pioneer its Verify Digital Identity Assurance Programme, along with 4 other organisations, including the UK Post Office and the credit reference agency Experian. We have been independently audited and accredited for information and security management under ISO 27001 for the last 9 years. We are a recognised supplier of UK public services and an accredited open banking account information service provider. So, once individuals are able to collect data about themselves from many different sources and to share and use this data for their own purposes, what value does this deliver? One thing we're enabling is richer, more personalized financial advice. For example, by enabling individuals to collect data about their financial position from many different providers, banks, credit card companies, loan providers, organizations that they owe money to, assets they hold, we're helping debt advisors provide better, more personalized advice to citizens struggling with debts. Once the advisor has provided the advice, individuals can use the same data to help them apply for new recommended services such as grants, benefits, consolidated loans, and so on. At the same time, we are helping to reduce the costs of providing these services. That's because a high proportion of these costs come not from actually doing the analysis and providing the advice, but from the time and effort spent trying to access and assemble the necessary data in the first place. We're also using improved data sharing to enable many separate service providers to collaborate together to integrate different specialist inputs into a single seamless whole. So, for example, take managing cancer journeys. Patients suffering from cancer don't only have a long, difficult journey with many different treatments involving many different specialist service providers. They also have to organize the logistics of getting to and from these appointments. They have to invest time and effort, keeping friends, families, carers informed of their latest updates, and the rest of their lives can be transformed too. They may not be able to work. They may face financial difficulties. They may need to move to a different accommodation. They may need to deal with legal matters such as wills. All this takes time, effort, and yes, stress to organize and manage. And it's all about data logistics, being able to share the right data with the right people at the right times. So, for example, we're working with a cancer charity in the UK called Macmillan Cancer, and we're helping cancer patients and support workers to organize and coordinate all these different tasks and activities into a single whole, using their personal data store as the logistics hub by which data is collected, shared, and used. This ability to access and use and reuse the right data at the right time is reducing Macmillan Cancer's support worker costs by between 50 and 90%, depending on the complexity of the case. We're applying the same principles to help public service providers reduce their costs while making it much easier for citizens to apply for and access services. If citizens are able to use pre-verified credentials about themselves when applying for services, the possibilities are endless. For example, using credentials about educational qualifications when applying for a job, employment status and income when applying for loans, social security status when applying for a grant or benefit, or indeed all of these things when trying to prove their identities. Enabling citizens to bring pre-verified credentials with them to service relationships makes it much easier for them to apply for and access these services. It makes form filling redundant. It also greatly reduces service providers' costs of collecting, checking, and processing the data. This is the principle behind the Scottish Government's planned Scottish Attribute Provider Service, which will provide citizens with their own attribute or personal data store, which enables them to safely collect and share details about themselves that have been generated by public services. So another application of the same infrastructure is providing privacy shielding targeting. With this, we enable individuals to publish anonymized profiles of themselves so that service providers can search these profiles for those individuals that match their services. Service providers can use our platform to message the right individuals without knowing who they are, asking if they are interested. If the individual says yes, they can simply press a button to share the relevant data and access the service in question. Glasgow City Council, Scotland's biggest city, is using this to identify poorer citizens eligible for additional support on childcare costs. Just one example. The Scottish Government is using this to identify and recruit citizens to help co-design the services designed for people like them. That particular project is called SHAPE, because it's citizens helping to shape the services that they use. The same infrastructure can be used to enable citizens to donate their data to good causes, such as medical research or local community projects. For example, there's a small fishing village called Brixham, where the community trust is using data from citizens to help the community address the many issues it faces. And we are using the same infrastructure to provide completely new to the world services. For example, it's a fact of organization-centric life that no organization has any particular interest in helping its customers improve their dealings with other organizations. Why should they? But because every organization behaves this way, there are many jobs that are important to individuals that organizations do not do. For example, CRM or customer relationship management is now a large industry providing organizations with the software and tools to manage their relationships with their customers. But where is the counterpart for individuals? In the industrialized world, citizens have over 100 different relationships with different service providers in central government, local government, banking, insurance, education, employment, travel, media, leisure, entertainment, retailing, and so on. But where is the industry providing individuals with the software and tools needed for supplier relationship management? This is what Mydex is now building. For example, we are providing our users with consents and permissions dashboards where individuals have one easy-to-use portal where they can see what data they have shared with each organization for what purpose, and can manage these settings, including exercising their rights under data protection legislation. And this is, they can manage all their service providers from one place. This, instead of having to log into each different service provider's website, navigate their way to my account, read the privacy policy, and so on. These new services, these new person-centric services, are emerging in the spaces between today's existing data silos, and they will transform the way that individuals manage their lives and get things done. And then finally, it all comes together with identity assurance, because is based on the citizen's ability to share and present verified credentials about themselves. The more verified credentials an individual has, the more they're able to prove their identity. So the point I'm making here is threefold. First, empowering citizens with their own data will transform relationships between individual service providers and individuals and service providers. Second, it covers all the main uses of data, analytics and decision-making, delivering better quality solutions, improving productivity and efficiency, improving the matching of supply to demand and supplies to users, enabling the delivery of social benefits, the innovation of new services, and identity assurance that underpins them all. The third point is that when individuals can bring safe, reliable, pre-checked information with them to service providers, there are significant benefits to service providers themselves. Increased access to richer, more reliable data, reduced costs of collecting, checking, processing, and using personal data, improved service quality and timeliness, new dimensions of innovation. This is the world that Mydeighta is opening up. Better outcomes, reduced friction, effort, risk, and cost for citizens and for service providers too. The big if is these benefits will only become available if Mydeighta is implemented in the right way. And over our 15 years experience in this field, we have learned there are many ways to get Mydeighta wrong. This leads us to a crucial question. What is the right model for the implementation of Mydeighta? When it comes to system architecture, infrastructure, governance, economic logic, business models, what design principles should we adopt? I will describe the design principles that we have adopted at Mydex and why we have adopted them. The first central question is, should our approach be person-centric or organization-centric? With the organization-centric approach to Mydeighta, individuals request or give permission to one organization holding data about them to share some details with other organizations. The data flows directly from organization to organization without the individual ever handling it. When the person-centric approach, organizations deposit details about the individual in the individual's personal data store under the individual's direct control. The individual then shares this data with other organizations as and when needed. They have their own records of what data is shared for what purpose. They have their own proofs. Looking at it from the perspective shown in this slide, the organization-centric approach seems simpler and easier. Why bother inventing a new entity, a new layer of infrastructure, the personal data store provider, and add new steps to the process when you don't need to? The organization-centric approach shown on the left hand of the slide is the one adopted by the UK at the moment with its open banking initiative, and I think with some Mydeighta experiments in Korea. The trouble is, the organization-centric approach does not scale. As more data gets shared between more organizations, it gets more and more complex. This is what the situation looks like if just 8 organizations are involved in accessing the individual's data. The number of connections between organizations jumps to 28, whereas the data flowing via the individual's personal data store, the number of connections that are needed rises to just 8. With the organization-centric approach, each time a new organization starts sharing data, the number of potential connections between organizations grows exponentially. Soon you have a complexity catastrophe. By the time 100 organizations are involved, which is about the number of data relationships each individual has, the potential number of connections needed in the direct organization to organization model of data sharing rises to 4,950. This is 50 times more complex, cumbersome, and expensive than if data is shared via a personal data store. In short, the organization-centric approach to Mydeter cannot scale without creating this complexity catastrophe. In doing so, it also creates a potential security catastrophe, as now 100 organizations are all having to expose their systems to 100 other organizations, rather than 1 or 2 tried and tested personal data store providers. It also creates a consents and permissions catastrophe, as individuals lose track of what organizations now hold about them, which bits of data, whereas with a person-centric approach, the personal data store helps individuals manage all their consents and permissions from one single dashboard. So while the organization-centric approach to Mydeter can work for a few specific limited use cases, in our view, any approach to Mydeter based on the sharing of individuals' data from one organization to another organization without putting the individual in the middle of the process can only create a strategic dead end. Person-centric, citizens empowered with their own personal data stores and data sharing tools is the way forward. A second design principle follows from this. Individuals should become the point at which data about themselves is integrated. With the current system, data about individuals is dispersed across many different organizations, probably over far more than 100 organizations for each individual. That means it's practically impossible to build up a rich, complete data picture of an individual without engaging in the biggest invasion of privacy ever. But if individuals are able to aggregate data about themselves and their lives in their own personal data stores, it is possible to build these new, rich, person-centric data assets that are impossible to create under today's siloed, organization-centric data architecture. As Mydeter progresses, we believe that increasingly service provision and innovation will revolve around these new person-centric data assets, precisely because they will be richer, more complete, and more useful than any data set, than any individual separate organization's data silo can build. If an organization-centric approach to Mydeter is adopted, the innovations and services that these new person-centric data assets made possible will never happen. The full potential of data-driven innovation will be stifled. Another key design principle of data principle follows from this. Given the enormous power and potential of the new data assets, it is essential that this data should be stored, managed, and controlled independently of any particular organization. If any organization can dictate to individuals who they can share their data with, for what purposes, or if any particular organization, including the state, holds this personal data in its own systems, or under its own control, then my data risks, again, turning into the biggest invasion of privacy ever, potentially the biggest abuse of data power. Therefore, a core design principle for a strategically viable My Data system has to be that individuals can collect, store, manage, use, and share their own data independently of the organizations that originally collected, generated, or used this data. And yet more follows from this slide. Today's organization-centric approach to data is based on multiple separate data silos, where each organization collects and uses its own data in isolation to all other organizations. With person-centric data sharing enabled by personal data stores, individuals can collect data from many different sources and share this data with many different service providers, old and new. This system has at least 3 functional layers: organizations that originate and generate data about individuals in the first place, personal data stores that collect, receive, aggregate, and store this data, and service providers who may be the same as the original originator organizations, accessing the data held in these personal data stores in order to provide services. Please remember, as I talk about the design principles here for my data, I'm talking mainly about the design principles for the middle layer of the personal data infrastructure, the layer that does the connecting, the data logistics. Within this, the activities of the other 2 layers of data originator and data user may remain surprisingly unchanged, except for the fact they now have new access to data that they didn't have before. So this new layer of data infrastructure introduces an important new principle. As we shift from silos to layers, we are also moving from a system where we integrate data storage and use to the separation of data storage and use. That's what new specialist infrastructure providers like Mydex do, take on the jobs of data storage and data sharing so that others don't have to. What other characteristics does this infrastructure need to display? It needs to be decentralized. With a current organization-centric approach, each organization holds data in its own big centralized database, big centralized databases that become targets for hackers. This cannot work in a My Data era when citizens are empowered with their own data. With a person-centric approach, each individual personal data store needs to be separate, not one new huge database of individuals, but millions of separate personal data stores, each one separately encrypted under the control of the individual whose data it is. The infrastructure also needs to deliver genuine citizen empowerment, not just having a say, a voice, not just choice between accepting or not accepting a set of terms and conditions, not just having to agree to data sharing from one organization to another, not just exit, having the ability to go to a different service provider. All of these things are important, but they are nothing without the ability to specify and to act. There is an awful lot of confusion today surrounding the idea that citizens should be able to assert control over their data, because the word control can be used to mean 2 opposite things: control over data held by organizations, or control over data held by citizens themselves, where they are able to collect, store, and use their own data for their own purposes. It's a bit like the difference between being allowed to ride in a taxi, but never being allowed to own your own car. Being able to drive your own data is what I mean by genuine citizen empowerment, and it is essential if my data is to succeed. But what about the personal data store provider itself? What about companies like Mydex? Won't we, as PDS providers, be able to see into each individual's personal data stores, thereby becoming a new source of privacy invasion? This danger creates another requirement: zero-knowledge operations. Personal data store providers should not be able to look into or exert any control over the data individuals hold in their personal data stores. This data is the individual's data, not an infrastructure provider's data. That is why with Mydex, each individual holds their own personal key to their data store, which Mydex does not hold and does not know. So even though Mydex hosts the data itself, only individuals can access and control its contents. A further consideration is which tech solutions to adapt. Some people think that new solutions such as distributed ledger or blockchain are a magic bullet that will solve all the problems. They won't. Like all technologies, they are good for some things and bad for others. The design principle for Mydeighta implementation is that it should be technology agnostic, and that it should be cloud-based. Because in the end, if it's based on devices, in the end, those devices get replaced or lost, and the data needs to be retained. And the only way to do that is through the cloud. Mobile devices are brilliant for making access to personal data stores easy, for creating easy user interfaces, but technology agnostic cloud-based solutions are the only strategically viable way forward to ensure lifetime storage of data and always-on access over secure connections. Now let's turn to governance. For the right infrastructure to work, it needs to be governed properly. And the key requirement when it comes to personal data is trust. Personal data is not just another commodity. We are dealing here with persons, people's lives. That doesn't make trustworthiness a marketing slogan. Trustworthiness needs to be built into rules, regulations, audit, accountability. It needs to be enforceable so that everyone can see it working. This is why Mydeighta is a community interest company in UK law. A community interest company is a business which acts like any other business, disciplined, commercial, but which uses its business skills to pursue a social mission. In our case, our mission is empowering citizens with their own data. It is a legal requirement of a community interest company that if we make profits, 2/3 of those profits must be reinvested in furthering our mission. We don't exist for shareholders. We exist for citizens to enable an ecosystem. That's not a slogan. It's built into our legal status. Of course, financial service providers also need to be trusted. But if the infrastructure or processes they use to access and use personal data is not trustworthy, then they themselves may be damaged. That means that all specialist Mydeighta infrastructure providers must have legally enforceable trustworthiness built into how they operate. Trustworthiness also raises questions about incentives. When it comes to Mydeighta, when we don't think Mydeighta institutions can work either as state bodies or as free market operators. Why is this? Because with state bodies, the risk is that the state will start using access to citizens' data for state and political purposes. And even the fact that this risk is present could be enough to undermine citizen trust in Mydeighta institutions. And with market actors, there is also the risk that they will prioritize profit maximization and shareholder value above serving and protecting citizens. So building fit-for-purpose Mydeighta infrastructure might require some institutional innovation too. The invention of new types of institutions that are neither state nor market controlled. Community interest companies are one example. Trusts, foundations, cooperatives, there are many different ways of doing it, but it needs to be done. Another aspect of trustworthiness is neutrality. The infrastructure and institution should work and be seen to work so that it never favors one group or organization over another. It cannot be seen to be allowing some organizations access to a person's data, but not others. It cannot charge some organizations more for access than others, or favor the competitive advantage of one organization over another. It needs to publish a consistent set of rules that everyone has to follow and which are enforced by the infrastructure as it runs. Its job is to protect and serve the citizen and trustworthy data sharing to have a full stop. Now, quickly, let's turn to economic logic and business models. Data institutions' business models need to support rather than undermine the right data architecture, infrastructure, and governance. Infrastructure providers need to be financially self-sufficient, not dependent on others for their income, so that control over the purse strings does not turn into control over purposes. The other side of this coin is that they should not be profit maximizing either. Whatever infrastructure we're talking about, roads, electricity, internet, broadband, the ideal cost of accessing such infrastructure is as close to zero as possible, not the highest margins possible, because that is what maximizes access and use. When Mydex enables citizens to bring pre-verified data with them to service providers, its main economic contribution is to reduce friction, effort, risk, and cost for both citizens and service providers when accessing and using data. It's not about making a margin on the trading or sharing of data. It's about enabling an economy-wide leap forward in productivity and efficiency. Within this, it is important that Mydex infrastructure providers cover their costs in ways that build in alignment to their mission of enabling neutral data sharing and citizen empowerment. For example, if the infrastructure charges more for this type of data than that, it'll become incentivized to promote this type of data rather than that. If it charges a fee every time data changes hands, then it becomes incentivized to encourage data sharing when it isn't needed. That is why we at Mydex charge fees for organizations to connect to the platform to enable data sharing, fees that are neutral about how much data is shared by who with you, because it is our job to enable, not to intervene in favor of special interests. Finally, and perhaps most important of all, Mydex infrastructure providers need to be built and designed to last, not for sale. Individuals start accumulating data about themselves before they're born, and they continue to generate data about themselves after they die. The infrastructure that serves them should therefore be designed to serve them for their whole lives and beyond. Is it really possible for a startup venture funded by venture capitalists focused on a profitable exit to commit to these sorts of timescales? We don't think so. It's easy to say that Mydex business models need to be aligned to Mydex economic logic and Mydex purposes, but it is a real challenge to make sure that such alignment actually happens. Okay, I think it's time for me to end. Let me sum up. We need new citizen empowering data sharing infrastructure to enable the economy and society-wide shift from an organization-centric approach to one based on the principle of one user, one use, to a citizen-centric data system that operates to the principle of many users, many uses. I've argued that the only new layer of citizen empowering data logistics infrastructure can fulfill this role. That is, it provides each individual with their own personal data stores where they can collect, store, use, manage, share their own data under their own control, independently of organizations that have collected data about them. which enables service providers to access more and better quality data at lower cost. And I've described the design principles needed to make this infrastructure work. Design principles which are very different to those which define how today's commercial systems operate. If the wrong design principles for MyData implementation are adopted, we risk the opposite: an inability to achieve system-wide progress, an inability to unleash the full potential of personal data, and loss of public trust as faulty designs make new abuses possible and likely. For those of you working in financial services, these design principles may seem unfamiliar, perhaps even alien, but they are design principles for the infrastructure that's needed for MyData to work. Not just for financial services themselves. If financial services are to truly benefit from MyData, it needs to persuade the government to build this infrastructure based on these principles. We have the opportunity to make immense progress to the benefit of all, but to do so, we need to get the details, the design right. Thank you. Thank you very much.
네, 감사합니다.
Yes, thank you very much. He has told us about the future that has to be taken by MyData. Now we are going to ask questions. We have already received some questions, and we also have questions coming up live via YouTube. So let me ask our first question. Mydex is able to get the government data because it is a community interest company. Is that true? So other MyData companies, do they have the authority to access government data?
Yes, we think it's a big advantage for us that government agencies can trust us, not only today, but tomorrow too, because we've not been built for a sale. How can a startup funded by venture capitalists looking for a profitable exit earn that sort of trust? But the government agencies will have to decide, will have to look closely at each different MyData operator to decide whether they're trustworthy. Some will be provided, some private sector companies will pass that test, but we think that many private sector companies will not pass that test, and that test needs to be decided by the government agencies themselves.
네, 고맙습니다.
Yes, thank you. This is going to be the second question. The Europeans, so what are their thoughts about MyData, and how much MyData are they using in their daily lives? Here in Korea, MyData is very unfamiliar. So what can you give us an answer to this question, please?
I think basically around the world, this is a very young industry. And like Korea, most people in Europe are not familiar with MyData, and that will take many years to change. It's a big development, and big developments take a lot of time to mature. So I suspect that we're probably very similar in Europe and Korea, that most people are still not familiar.
네, 고맙습니다. 이어지는 질문들은
Yes, thank you. Now we have live questions. And the first live question is that with the introduction of MyData, traditional financial institutions and the boundary between the traditional financial institutions and big tech companies are disappearing. Who do you think is going to be the winner over the financial platform?
That to me is not the important question. I think the winner will be the citizen, and the citizen will choose who they wish to do business with and who they trust. And what we're trying to do with MyData is to enable the citizen to make those choices. So I agree that there are very, very big structural changes taking place in technology and financial services industries. But I think the even bigger is the impact of individuals being able to participate in the system in ways that they haven't been able to participate up till now.
네, 물론 구조적인
Yes, that structure change is going to be tremendous, and the benefits, I believe, will be enjoyed mostly by the citizens. And this is the second question. Because of information imbalance, there is a difference rising among individual assets and culture. Do you think my data is going to accelerate these differences?
I think as individuals are able to aggregate data about themselves under their own control and build up personal data assets which are independent of organizations, they get used to managing their data. If you think about something similar with financial services, 100 years ago, people weren't used to managing their money in the way that they do now. And I think the same now is happening with data. And I think that this is a big change that will be unfolding over a long time, over decades. But the information imbalances are beginning to change, and that is a benefit not only to individuals but to society as a whole.
네, 고맙습니다. 계속해서 질문을 또 드리겠습니다.
So we do have so many questions for you. So let me ask the next question.
강연에서
In your presentation, you said that at the request of individual, there's going to be a movement to a person-centric model using PDS. You said that's the more desirable model. But here in Korea, we have an organization-centric model. And so for us to become more person-centric, what should we do?
I think there are many halfway houses, but I think the issue is the development, the creation of the personal data stores for individuals, and government can act as an enabler. Government can act as a buyer of the service, but if the government is the actual provider of the service, then there gets to be issues. So I think that from what I understand, what's happened in Korea so far is that it's a first step, and the next steps needs to be to move from that organization-centric approach to the person-centric approach. I think the likelihood of what might happen with the current approach is that it has limited growth and applicability. And that is the problem that might occur in future years if the person-centric infrastructure is not developed.
네, 고맙습니다. 이어지는 질문은요.
So let me move on to the next question. So in my data industry, that is organization-centric and the person-centric, you talked about those my data industries. And for individuals to be able to manage and control my data, then there has to be education about data management and data sovereignty. So do you provide such services at Mydex?
Yes, we do. But I think there's also an element of misunderstanding about how much education is needed, in the sense that at the moment, our system is very, very complicated. It's over complex, with many individuals having to deal with, say, 100 different organizations' privacy policies. What we do is we provide standardized data sharing agreements that are very simple. That, for example, say, if I'm sharing my data with you, you'll only use this data for the purposes of providing this service. You won't give the data to anybody else. And so I think, along with education, simplification is key.
네, 고맙습니다. 이어지는 질문은요.
And thank you. Next question. So based on the collected data, do you sell the data and make a profit? Sell the data to other companies to make the profits. And so, what is your profit model in your company's profit model?
Yes. As I said, I think if trust is to be maintained, service providers, personal data service providers, cannot sell the data. It's just simply as that. We just do not sell the data. We make our money. We earn the money that we earn from organizations connecting to our platform. We enable the data to be read and written between the organization and the individual's personal data store. And that is neutral. We are not trying to monetize any data. We are providing a platform service.
네, 고맙습니다. 정말 많은
Yes, thank you. We do have so many questions, but let me ask just one last question before we let you go.
앞서 답변 주신 거랑 조금 겹칠 수
This may be a question that overlaps with the previous question. Korea's Myde이터 business is being led by the government. So, what do you think about this?
I think it's very, from what I can see about what's happening in Korea, it's very, very positive. It seems to me that the Korean government is doing far more, is leading the world, in fact, in terms of committing to developing Myde이터. There are lots of questions that still have to be answered, but the fact that it is government-led means that you'll be bringing together more people to do more things than would otherwise be happening. And this is a very positive development.
네, 고맙습니다.
Yes, thank you. That was Mr. Alan Mitchell. Thank you so much for your presentation as well as your kind answers.